Welcome to In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson. Join Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible, both from Milligan College, as they bring you their thoughts and knowledge of the study of the Sunday School lesson for the day. Now, here is Dr. Magnus.
Good morning, and welcome to In the Word. I hope you get to be in worship this morning as well, but whether you do or not, we're grateful that you've joined us in the Word this morning, and we'll be continuing our study of God's Word on the theme of covenant. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Roberts this morning as co-teacher and conversationalist. Dr. Gwaltney, who's our regular host and teacher, wasn't able to be here this week, and so we're grateful for Dr. Roberts. You've done this a couple times before, haven't you?
A few times. I'm glad to be back.
Yeah,
appreciate
so good.
The opportunity.
So this is nothing brand new to you, and Dr. Roberts and Dr. Gwaltney and I taught together at Milligan College for decades, right?
That's true.
I won't say how many, but not just years, but decades. Yeah. And so we're always happy for the opportunity to work together and continue teaching together. Yeah. Well, we're nearing the end of our quarter's study on the concept of covenant, our covenant with God. And we're coming to the last unit now, which is entitled The Everlasting Covenant. We're going to have four really interesting lessons, two from the Old Testament, then moving on into the New Testament. And so we'll continue that theme. Let's remind ourselves a little bit, Dave, about this concept of covenant. How do you like to explain it?
It's a binding relationship between two personages, and the examples we've got in the Old Testament, it was not a contract of equal to equal, but what's called a suzerainty covenant, which is a greater, as in a king with a lesser, as in subjects. But the relationship was such that there were commitments made on each side, and it was a binding relationship that was a continuing connection on through time.
Okay, so it's not like a contract or an agreement, say buying a used car,
right,
where there's $5,000 on the sticker, and I say I'll give you $3,500, and he says how about $4,500? It's not like a negotiated thing,
right,
is it? So there are terms that bind both parties to the covenant, but one sets the covenant. I remember one time when I went home to visit after I was grown up and gone from home, and my father handed me a little blue enveloped form and asked me to read it. It was his last will and testament. And when I finished reading all the pages, he didn't say, "Do you have any suggestions?" or whatever. There was never any question that I would set the terms of it, but I was bound by it.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit like that, that kind of a covenant. The Hebrew concept of covenant literally involved a cutting into two parts, and then something came between those two parts that sealed that covenant. And that's kind of like a handshake today. We put something between the two parties, and this more seriously has implications for our understanding of Jesus and the covenant in his blood.
Yeah.
And the cross and things like that.
And it's really an amazing thing that the Judeo-Christian perspective of God is that he would enter into covenant with humans and bind himself in a relationship that is in perpetuity.
Yeah, and would communicate the terms of that arrangement to them, unlike the mythologies of the ancient Near East, where gods just did things to human beings according to their own whims, and there was never any sense of communication or a relationship on which the covenant was based. And that's all very different.
Yeah.
And we can see that throughout the Old Testament, and it extends right up into the Christian story as well. Okay, well, thanks for that little review of covenant. Now, our lesson today is in two distinct parts. They're related, but the first one comes from the book of Numbers, near the end of the book of Numbers. So let's set the context for that.
The people of Israel have come out of Egypt. They've come through the wilderness. They're nearing the promised land.
Yeah.
But now that they're coming near, the temptations rise.
Yeah. They've reached the land of Moab, which is right across the Jordan River from the promised land, their goal, and they pause there to kind of get their act together after these years of wilderness living. And it's while they're there living in relative comfort that they begin being tempted to idol worship by the Moabite people, and that causes a reaction, of course. The priest is Aaron, and his grandson is a young man named Phineas, who is particularly offended by Israelites marrying Moabite women and adopting their pagan religious practices. And the immediate background of our printed text is Phineas finding an Israelite man and a Moabite woman together,
Right.
and stabbing them through, the both of them.
A little bit violent
with a spear.
reaction.
It's a very violent reaction. Now, in our printed text, we're going to see the interpretation of his actions, and we can talk about that. So,
Yeah, the conduct was such that it doesn't even indicate so much marriage as just intercourse.
cohabiting.
Yes, they
yeah.
were having
They're just
relationships.
sleeping around.
Right.
With so that sexual immorality was just kind of part of that pagan religion there.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you read this first passage for us then?
From Numbers 25, verses 10 to 13. The Lord said to Moses, Phineas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, has turned my anger away from the Israelites, since he was as zealous for my honor among them as I am. I did not put an end to them in my zeal. Therefore tell him I am making my covenant of peace with him. He and his descendants will have a covenant of a lasting priesthood, because he was zealous for the honor of his God and made atonement for the Israelites.
Well, this is quite a description of this Phineas guy here. We don't know much about him. We don't teach this passage very often. It's not really one suitable for teaching children,
Right.
I think. So it doesn't turn up in Vacation Bible School.
We don't mention it
literature
much.
very often. We don't mention it. But this is quite a statement about the effect of this man and his violent action. We probably ought to explain the phrase, has turned away my anger from the Israelites. I don't think we've mentioned that yet.
The corruption and the immorality were such that you really get the impression from what God was saying to Moses that the relationship with Israel was just about to be ended because of their immorality. And it was a critical time.
Yeah, two things are happening. One is the leadership, the priests, are ordered to kill the tribal leaders who are permitting this sexual immorality and idolatry. The two are going hand in hand. To kill the leaders for permitting that.
Yes.
Well, that would have devastated the nation.
Yeah.
And on top of that, the leaders are told to kill anyone acting in that way, participating. So the participants and the permitters are ordered to be killed.
Yeah.
And that would have devastated the nation. Then there's also mention of a plague.
Yes.
That we don't know the details of that, but a plague swept through the people as they're encamped there in Moab. So Yeah, you're right. This sin in Moab would have devastating consequences.
In Phineas's violent and zealous response seems shocking to us, but because of the nature and severity of it, it was really a turning point.
It was. And this passage says that because of his zeal, he has reestablished, as it were, the tenuous relationship between God and the covenant people.
Made atonement.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong statement
It really
right
is.
there. You usually think of a priest making atonement on the Day of Atonement for all of the people, but here this one young man, not even, I mean, he's a priest, but he's not a high priest yet, is taking upon himself a daring act to try to put an end to this immorality and also appease God's anger, is the way it's described.
And God offers the covenant of peace, an everlasting covenant for the
That's an
priesthood.
interesting phrase, isn't it? Covenant of
It
peace.
is, yeah.
The Hebrew word is shalom, of course, so this is a covenant of shalom. Now, I wonder what peace he's talking about there. God is quoted as saying, I am making my covenant of peace with him. So the word shalom literally means wholeness. So I guess the idea is that by Phineas' zealous action, he's bringing wholeness back to the relationship between God and the covenant people, reestablishing peace with them.
Yeah.
Well, then in verse 13, the covenant is described differently. Here it's called a covenant of lasting priesthood, kind of to reward Aaron and his family for their continued faithfulness, even in the midst of this horrible adultery and immorality. But that's an interesting phrase, lasting.
It is.
It's a lasting priesthood because it didn't last.
Right.
As we're about to see, it didn't last. So in how should we think of this? Do you think is it lasting or is it not lasting?
Well, the commitment of God is that it's an everlasting commitment, but because it's a covenant, there are two sides to it, and the expectation is that the other party will maintain the relationship as well. If that's broken, if the covenant is broken from that side, then it's beyond God's commitment to maintain it if person or the other party doesn't keep it.
God, in God's faithfulness, will no doubt, and always does, reestablish that covenant with faithful people who can carry it on. But at any given time, in any given generation, that covenant can be violated by unfaithfulness.
Yeah.
And that's the point of the title of our lesson today, which is a good title, Faithful God, Unfaithful People.
Yeah.
Not that all the people were unfaithful. Phineas was certainly not unfaithful, but many people were, and as a result, they put that covenant relationship at risk. The covenant relationship of God and his people had been put at risk continuously.
Oh, time after time.
I mean, God covenanted with Adam and Eve, and they put it at risk by their sin. Same is true with Noah's generation. Same is true at the Tower of Babel. Even Abraham, as faithful as he was, frequently put the covenant at risk.
Yes,
Like-
and his descendants.
Yeah,
All the way through.
yeah. He just named them Jacob and the sons of Jacob and all that. So that's part of the tragic story of covenant. The wonderful part of the story of covenant is the faithfulness of God
Right.
throughout all of that.
Yeah.
Now, we haven't talked about this word zeal, which occurs so frequently in this short little passage we've been studying here. Since he was zealous for my honor, speaking of Phineas, And then it comes out again in verse 13, because he was zealous for the honor of his God. How do you understand this concept of zeal?
It's a fascinating word because it's connected to the word jealous, and it's the opposite of the blasé, who cares attitude that sometimes people seem to develop with regard to their faith.
Yeah.
And Phineas made it of prime importance and prime concern, and when there was this violation, he had to step up and do something.
Yeah. So zeal is a very powerful word, like you say. The same word can be translated jealous as can be translated zealous. I don't want to approve Phineas's actions.
No, we're not encouraging it.
We're not encouraging violence as a means of carrying out the will of God. But you can't fault his attitude or his zeal.
His spirit.
His spirit, yeah. You can't fault that. And it makes you wonder if our own faithfulness as Christians is matched by a zeal, doesn't it? It's pretty easy for me, at least, to slip into kind of I'll use your good word, a blasé faithfulness.
Yeah, we get comfortable.
Yeah, I'm not doing any kind of gross, obvious idolatry. Maybe subtle little idolatries, but nothing that people would say, "Oh, that's idolatrous." But I may be observing lots of idolatry going on around me and never saying a word about it. At any rate, Christians are called to be zealous as well, aren't they? Yeah. Well, we've got a second passage here, so maybe we should go ahead and address that. We jump now to 1 Samuel. And when I say jump, I mean jump.
It's moved centuries, and it's a stark contrast.
Yeah, this is so different in a very interesting way. We really have jumped. Let's see now. We were right on the border of the Promised Land, ready to enter. So we haven't even gotten to in the previous passage.
Yes.
We hadn't even gotten to the story of Joshua.
Right.
And crossing the Jordan River, conquering the Promised Land.
Distribution of territory.
The tribal territories, that's right. And then we hadn't gotten to the book of Judges, which is some people think 200, some people think 300 years of life in the Promised Land, guided not by kings, but by military leaders who rise up whenever there's a threat. And that lasted a couple of hundred years. So we're leaping over all of that to the very end of the period of the Judges, into the story, or near the story of Samuel.
Right. He's in the picture, but not yet coming into age. Yeah,
he's already come on the scene, but this part of the story isn't actually about Samuel himself. It does refer to the sons of Eli. So let's talk about Eli for a minute. Okay. He also was a priest, wasn't he?
Yes, he was the mentor to Samuel, and was apparently faithful to God. But in his old age, he lost his eyesight and apparently lost his zeal as far as maintaining his family's fidelity to God.
Yeah. He seems to have mentored Samuel well, but not mentored his own sons.
Two sons.
Well, it's a saddest. For me, it's one of the, as the parent of two sons, and you have two sons.
Yes.
It's one of the saddest stories. This great godly man, Eli, and what a mess his two sons were. So that's what we've jumped to. What we have here is a prophecy by an unnamed prophet.
A man of God.
He's referred to as the man of God, and he does make a prophecy, so I think we can call him a prophet, but we don't know who he is. But he talks about what's going to happen to Eli's family. And in the process, we learn a little more about this concept of God covenanting and including an everlasting priesthood as part of that covenant.
Right.
So I'll read this one.
Okay.
We start at 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 30. Therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promised that members of your family would minister before me forever. But now, the Lord declares, far be it from me. Those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be disdained. The time is coming when I will cut short your strength and the strength of your priestly house, so that no one in it will reach old age, and you will see distress in my dwelling. Although good will be done to Israel, no one in your family line will ever reach old age. Every one of you that I do not cut off from serving at my altar, I will spare only to destroy your sight and sap your strength, and all your descendants will die in the prime of life. And what happens to your two sons, Hophni and Phineas, will be a sign to you. They will both die on the same day. I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who will do according to what is in my heart and mind. I will firmly establish his priestly house, and they will minister before my anointed one always. Then everyone left in your family line will come and bow down before him for a piece of silver and a loaf of bread and plead, appoint me to some priestly office so I can have food to eat.
That's a devastating message.
What a pitiful message there.
Yes.
Yeah. And so what we see here is that although God established a lasting priesthood as part of his covenant, that can be compromised, that can be ended by the actions of any one generation or any one priest.
Hophni and Phineas were notorious in their day, and it was widely known. They were in the priesthood, not the high priest, but they were in the priesthood and were violating their position by abusing women, by taking more than was warranted from the sacrificial offerings that were presented. And Eli was aware of it and even scolded them, but allowed them to continue.
Yeah. So his physical blindness was matched by a kind of, it's not exactly spiritual blindness, because he seems to have had a close personal relationship with God, but when it came to his children, there was a kind of a blindness there that compromised his ministry as a priest and, in a sense, ended his family's ability to serve as priests, and certainly did Hophni and Phineas no favors.
Right. It's amazing that we've got these two people named Phineas in such contrast.
I know. I knew both of these stories and have known them for years, but I never put them together.
I had never thought of it either until I saw this Sunday school lesson.
Our lesson writers have put our two Phineases together, along with his brother Hophni. But the first Phineas is so faithful and zealous in a good way,
right?
Although using exaggerated, violent methods. The second Phineas is such a violator of everything that a priest should do in terms of morality and in terms of ministry. They really stand in sharp contrast to one another. The verse 30 is interesting. I promised that members of your family would minister before me forever. There's that idea of an everlasting priesthood. But then the next sentence starts, but now, in other words, the Lord actually changes because of the violation of the covenant by human beings.
Breaking of the covenant.
Yes. So there's a sense in which God's faithfulness is sure, but it's also a kind of contingent faithfulness, or at least modified by the reaction of human beings in that covenant relationship. Well, there's a prophecy in verse 34 that Hophni and Phineas will both die on the same day. And if we fast forward a couple of chapters, we might just mention what does happen to them?
It's a fascinating story because the Philistines become the archenemy of Israel at this point and are dominating to the point where Israel just can't seem to stand. And so someone comes up with the idea, if we take the Ark of the Covenant into the battle with us, we can't lose. And so Hophni and Phineas take the Ark of the Covenant, they go into battle, the Philistines hear them cheering, and they say, we've got to fight harder, and they do. They defeat the Israelites, they capture the Ark, they kill both Hophni and Phineas, and of course there's a story of when they get the Ark, it's not good news for them. But the word comes back to Eli that the battle is lost and his sons have died. He falls over, breaks his neck, and dies on the spot.
It's just so tragic.
It really
is
is.
so tragic. And Hophni and Phineas, who have already violated their priestly obligations by their sexual immorality with women at the tabernacle and by stealing food that otherwise should be offered to God, now at the end do something equally stupid and wrong by taking the ark into battle as if it were some kind of secret weapon or
a lucky charm,
magical thing. And as a result, they are also killed in that battle.
It's interesting that in recent times, we've had a lot in the news about abuse of position by priests, and it's nothing new.
Yeah.
The two sons of Eli were abusing their role, and it can happen at any time.
And it involved sexual matters, and it involved possessions, so wanting more, not money, but greed.
Self-serving.
Greed. And those two things frequently motivate people to do wrong things today in ministry.
Yeah, and such a contrast of this Phineas being so self-serving and the other Phineas being so zealous for the Lord.
Yeah. Well, the climactic verse in this passage is verse 35, where we have the promise, I will raise up for myself a faithful priest. These priests have violated their covenant of shalom, but God has not, and he just keeps maintaining the priesthood even with a new priest. And this faithful priest will do what is in God's heart and mind, not what is in their own selfishly. And they will minister before my anointed one always. On a historical level, what this probably means is that God will raise up a new priestly line who will minister to the coming king, the anointed one, David. And we do know that Samuel ministered to David in a priestly way.
And Zadok.
And Zadok also became a priest that was supportive of David. But in the long run, from a Christian perspective, when we read faithful priest and anointed one, we think of Jesus and our role as a royal priesthood as well, serving our anointed one, the Messiah, Jesus Christ.
And the book of Hebrews refers to Jesus as both the king and the priest.
Yeah. And so ultimately Jesus fulfills both of these roles and brings about atonement for us as well. So all of the roles that are discussed here find a unity in Jesus.
The faithful God.
Eventually. Say, thanks for joining us today. We've had a good discussion in the Word and hope that you have a wonderful day of worship and a good week living in the Lord. We hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
This has been In the Word, a study of the International Bible School lesson with Dr. Lee Magnus, Professor Emeritus of Bible from Milligan College, and Dr. Bill Gwaltney, Professor Emeritus of Bible of Milligan College. Join us again next week for another lesson from the International Bible School lesson text. This has been a production of the First Christian Church Television Ministries.